My name is Pentz Gunter. I'm actually with a non-profit called Beyond Nuclear. Beyond Nuclear International is our news site, which I hope you'll check out. And I'm really happy to be making my first visit to Glasgow, I'm ashamed to say, today. What a great reason to come here. Some of you in the room might be old enough to remember my father, who was vice chair of CND back in the day, Mike Pentz, and co-created Scientists Against Nuclear Arms before it morphed into Scientists for Global Responsibility. So there's a bit of DNA history here as well. So I entitled my talk, The View from the Ferris Wheel When the Human Beings Become Dots, which may seem a rather bizarre choice of imagery, but the reason being that I think it really speaks to the kind of climate of lack of empathy that we've fallen into today, where we tend to look at each other as dots, which is what you see from the great height of the Ferris wheel. You know, dots are sort of faceless and expendable. And tragically, obviously, we're seeing that played out right now in terms of what's happening in Gaza. The origin of that image is a film called The Third Man, which was made in 1949. Full confession, it's my favorite film, so I had to figure out some way to squeeze this in. But I do think it is actually relevant because that loss of empathy is brought most vividly to life by the character Harry Lime, played by Orson Welles there in the picture, who is a black marketeer, and this famous iconic scene, he's riding the Prater Ferris wheel in post-war Vienna, talking to his longtime friend Holly Martins, who's come to see him, played by Joseph Cotton, and they're looking down at children playing in the fairground below, at which point Martins scolds Lime for the harm he's caused those children, they can see, by selling diluted penicillin on the black market to the people that Lime calls the suckers and the mugs. And this is how Harry Lime responds. Victims, don't be melodramatic. Look down there. Would you really feel any pity if one of those dots stopped moving forever? If I offered you £20,000 for every dot that stopped moving, would you really, old man, tell me to keep my money? Or would you calculate how many dots you could afford to spare? Nobody thinks in terms of human beings. Governments don't. Why should we? Now, that thinking pervades what we see today, I think, in the nuclear profiteering, that they are not thinking of people in terms of human beings. We are their dots. And this is just one example from NATO, where it's full confession really here, credible deterrence and defense based on an appropriate mix of nuclear, conventional, and missile defense capabilities, complemented by space and cyber capabilities, remains a core element of NATO's overall strategy to prevent conflict and war. Now that's why CND's No to NATO campaign is so important and makes sense, because it's all there in black and white in terms of what NATO is actually about. And it pervades this thinking that, you know, we somehow need nuclear weapons, and we might even use them. And it justifies this obscene spending, which actually Phil also referred to. This is a slide from ICANN, where you can see $83 billion a year spent on nuclear weapons around the world. That's $157,664 a minute. Imagine that. That's just gone in the last minute that I was speaking. And of course, you can see the lead perpetrator up there by far, is the United States, but the UK not that far behind. And again, it speaks to this idea that it's sort of a prestigious thing to have. And it also reveals the insanity of deterrence theory, which is that spending 82+ billion a year on weapons that are too dangerous to use makes us safer and keeps the peace. So there, cue the suckers and the mugs. And actually, if you start to try and explain the myth of deterrence to people, you say, well, it's really a question of belief. You know, if the other side believes you would never use them because they're too dangerous to use, they're sure you would never use them, then you don't need them because you're never going to use them. But if the other side thinks that maybe you would use them and you got them to frighten them off, and they think you would use them, then they might use their nuclear weapons first, just to be sure that you don't use yours on them. So either way, not deterrence, right? So reducing people and humanity to dots really made the way, I feel, for the firebombing of Tokyo and Dresden, obviously the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It made way for Auschwitz. It made way for bombing the Marshall Islands and Maralinga. It made way for a thinking, this is an actual quote, about the Marshallese from an American official saying that although they are savages, they are more like us than mice. And that, is a sort of chilling admission of this treatment of people as lesser than somehow. When we look at human beings as dots, it made way for the human errors that led to Bhopal and the dam breach in Libya. It made way for the dropping of more ordnance on Vietnam than all of the ordnance dropped together in World War II. Vietnam, a tiny country which has never recovered from that devastation, not even mentioning Agent Orange there. It made way for the bombings of Syria and Yemen and other places, Ukraine, and the denial of safe haven to desperate refugees fleeing and drowning in leaking boats. It made way for the boy on the beach, and of course now the terrible crimes being carried out in Gaza and in Israel. And yet, the Harry Limes are among us, and in fact we've elected a lot of them to public office, and they are still making the same calculations about how many dots they can afford to spend. And that's a list, again coming from ICANN, of some of, actually all of the major nuclear weapons purveyors who think of us as dots and are really being served. I mean, these are the people that profit from that 83 billion. How we are prepared to sacrifice dots in order to keep the arms manufacturers happy. We talk about planet Earth, but really this is the blue planet, right? But this is not the kind of blue planet that we want to have. This is the blue planet of ice and of nuclear winter. It's a diagram done by Alan Robock and his colleagues at Rutgers, which shows after 1 year after a so-called limited use of nuclear weapons between India and Pakistan, what the temperatures would look like. But that's the kind of planet that we are likely to have if we continue to serve the nuclear weapons corporations. But we don't want the red hot one either. So we don't want to have that as our picture when we fail to tackle the climate crisis. And we really can't buy into that nonsense that I referred to earlier, and that we're still being sold, that we might even survive a nuclear war. Surely anyone who did would wish that they had not. There was even recently a PSA that was brought out in New York City, which said something to the effect of, nuclear war? I got this, like milk. I mean, it was incredible how it was obscene actually, how it downplayed this idea that don't worry, just run into your basement, close the windows, hang out for a while and you got this. No, we know. So we have to therefore do everything in our power to prevent this, because imagine how many dots we would lose if in fact we had another use of nuclear weapons in war. And it could happen at the mere push of a button. Missiles fired with no ability to recall them, billions slaughtered, smoke plumes leading to a global famine. It would be a crime not only against the generations forced to experience that, but also against the future generations who would therefore never be here at all. So if we are merely dots, what can we do? As it turns out, quite a bit. So some of the dots rebelled and secured the adoption of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The chosen strategy to ensure its ratification was to anchor the argument for nuclear abolition not in numbers and science and statistics, but around the tragic humanitarian consequences. And that's really what made it work. And one of the important aspects of the TPNW, as it's known, is that it acknowledges the need to assist the victims of nuclear weapons use. The nuclear powers are now forced to confront those faceless dots and to hear their testimony, recounting the atomic atrocities at Maralinga and in the Marshall Islands and even on US soil. And those stories and experiences repeat themselves with a chilling consistency, whether they are civilians or whether they were the military personnel forced to take part. They were all guinea pigs, they were all lab rats, and their lives were discounted, really, as a grand experiment. So what if we spent some of that $83 billion wasted on weapons that we would supposedly never use to help the dots, the people still struggling with the deadly legacies of the atomic age? What if we used those $83 billion to end world hunger, or to make a real effort at the 11th hour to save ourselves from climate chaos? But instead, as you can see by this graph, it's a year old, but it's more or less still the same. This is the US discretionary spending budget, something that the National Priorities Project puts out each year. And it shows that basically half the pie is gone immediately to military spending. And then you see what the slivers are, which are all the really important things. That's how skewed our priorities have become. But there are other things that we need to do, and the reason, I'm sorry this is a rather busy slide, but there are all sorts of things that belong on it. And it's really about the nuclear power problem, because nuclear power is the elephant in the room that impedes both being successful in order to address the climate crisis and being successful in abolishing nuclear weapons. And there are two problems here that nuclear power is in the way of. The way it impedes climate crisis, there's a list a mile long. I've just selected, a few of the most obvious ones. But when we look at existing nuclear power plants, they are more expensive now, the ones that are still running, to maintain and keep operational than providing the same services with new renewables or by using electricity more efficiently. So if you keep existing reactors open, which is what's happening in the United States, for example, and is being attempted now in France and elsewhere, you are pouring more money to prop those up than you could have put into renewables and efficiency to reduce more carbon. And those billions that we waste on new reactors, and billions are being wasted just on research and development right now of new reactors, could also deliver more carbon reductions faster for the same amount if invested in renewables instead. So whether we're talking existing or new, we're wasting money. Now, this next stat is from James Hansen, a former NASA scientist who's evangelically pro-nuclear power and thinks that this is the answer. And even he, I don't know if he reads his own statistics, but even he said we'd need 115 new reactors a year until 2050 in order to make a serious impact on the climate crisis. Now, that has never happened in the history of nuclear power. In fact, it has negative learning. So nuclear power plants have over the years become slower to build and more expensive to build. So there's no prospect whatsoever of this happening. And if that's the only number that counts, it's pointless, because again, you're wasting precious time and money that could reduce the carbon much quicker if invested properly. And of course, then we hear about small modular reactors, the new great mousetrap, nuclear mousetrap that will solve everything. And this is another fantasy. It'll take years. I mean, you just have to look around at Hinkley or at Flammable or whatever. And these are this is technology we understand and know, and we can't even build that in 5-10 years, let alone 20. So this is not going to happen anytime soon, if at all. You would need hundreds of them to make any kind of economic sense, which means somebody's got to invest in an upfront factory. It's just not going to happen. So that is a fantasy. But switching over to how nuclear power impedes a nuclear weapons ban, small modular reactors are nothing to do with electricity. Don't believe that story that they're selling you. It's not about that. It's about the bomb. And it's in black and white. And there are lots of citations. I just chose this one published in the Atlantic Council, which says civilian nuclear power and the associated supply chain are interwoven with key US national security priorities, specifically US leadership in global nuclear non-proliferation norms, the support of the nuclear navy, and the nation's nuclear deterrent. So they are absolutely 100% dependent on this flow of personnel and know-how into the military sector. They want small modular reactors. They're the only people who want it, and it's the only reason it's happening. The other impediment to disarmament that is provided by nuclear power is unfortunately embedded in our two treaties, in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and sadly also in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that is that this clause, which is Article 4 in the NPT, the inalienable right of the states parties to develop research, production and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. If you continue to provide countries that say they want nuclear power with a pathway to the bomb, we will never get full disarmament. You only have to think also about why countries like Saudi Arabia want nuclear power. Now they'll tell you it's because we don't want to burn so much oil, so we'll export our oil and we'll have nuclear power instead to replace that electricity. Saudi Arabia, a very sunny, windy place. There's no rationale for them actually wanting nuclear power if they need it for electricity. It's all about weapons. So those are some of the reasons that we have to eradicate that thinking. Now, I understand the background as to why it went into the TPNW. It's considered an equity issue. So a lot of countries, and especially the global south, said, well, you've had the opportunity to choose nuclear energy amongst the choices for a long time. If you deprive us of it, and I'm probably paraphrasing this, not absolutely right because I wasn't part of this, but if you deprive us of this, it's somehow discriminatory and an equity issue. But what's lost, of course, is that this was never a benefit especially for countries in the global south. And therefore, it isn't an equity issue. It's actually a colonial, predatory, racist technology that will not help them achieve equity. Who really benefited? Who has benefited from nuclear power? On the one hand, you could say, yes, the Parisian diners and their candlelight dinners by the Seine have benefited, but not the miner in Niger who mined that uranium for them, who in this picture, is gathering water because they live without running water, and many of them without electricity in Arlit, where most of the French reunions come from. Who's really benefited from turning their lights on with nuclear power? The person who's going to buy this $35 million mansion just outside Washington, D.C., which is currently on the market with goodness knows how many light bulbs. What about the Navajo uranium miners who mined uranium for years for the American weapons sector and the electricity? That's how they live right now today, many of them. Again, deprived of fundamental human rights. So who benefited? Again, this is another array of people. The little girl in Jadiguda, uranium mining town in India, you see her at the top there, who was born unable to move, unable to speak, and died at 13 in a community riven with birth defects as these mines continue to pollute their environment. What about the Fukushima cattle farmer? He's died now, unfortunately, that back there on the end, who had to slaughter all his cows. The people, there's Yulia with the scar she's from Ukraine. She had her thyroid removed. It's known as the Chernobyl necklace, that scar, because it was so pervasive. Did she benefit from nuclear power? Did the uranium worker in South Africa? Did the Niger worker? What about the Aboriginal people who live around the horrendous, now closed, Ranger uranium mine in South Africa? This industry is still, though, a white Western colonialist predator. The companies that are going into the global south to plunder it and bring this benefit are companies like Rosatom from Russia, Orano used to be called Areva. They always change their name when they have a bad time, from France, and Westinghouse from the United States. The problem with continuing to offer this inalienable right to develop so-called peaceful nuclear energy to countries who forswear nuclear weapons is sort of like keeping the drawbridge down on the peace castle. Yeah? If you leave the drawbridge down, but you say, we're all for abolition of nuclear weapons, but we'll let you keep nuclear power, that's like leaving it open, and they will always come back in. And that's exactly why we are worried about Iran. That's exactly why we're worried about Saudi Arabia. We're giving them the know-how, the technology, the personnel, the materials to develop the bomb, which is the only reason they want nuclear energy. So, as was said so beautifully this morning in the plenary, we cannot be siloed. We do have to bring the anti-nuclear weapons movement and the climate movements together. But I implore you also to remember to bring the anti-nuclear power movement under this umbrella and always mention it in the same breath, because it's the same thing. And CND, I have to applaud, I was at the conference last week, adopted some fantastic resolutions, all of which decried and deplored nuclear power as well in the same breath. So CND and International Physicians for the Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons are both organizations that are taking the lead now to say that nuclear power, as we can see in Ukraine, is a liability that could spread radiation far and wide. It harms people, especially women, children, babies, and we cannot abolish one without abolishing the other. So thank you so much. This is just my details here. So our NGO, which is based in Tacoma Park, Maryland, one of the first nuclear-free cities in the United States, is Beyond Nuclear. We have a news site, which if you have an article, yournuclear.org. So thanks so much.
Hello. It's a great privilege to be addressing this very important conference. My basic message is that we're suffering from peak militarism, which I believe is a suicidal risk for humanity. It's leading to huge numbers of deployed nuclear weapons, and similar processes are leading to catastrophic inaction on the perils of climate overheating and climate change. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has judged that 2023 is the most dangerous in humanity's history. They give several reasons for this. Primarily, I would say, the new heightened risk of nuclear war, a growing climate emergency, and finally, I won't go into all of them, they're exceeding 6 of 9 planetary survival boundaries. Here they are. Any one of the bars in red are a serious problem for the future of humanity. They haven't finished us off yet, but they could do so. The loss of biodiversity, the acidification of the oceans. The one that this stresses is at the top is climate change. If nuclear weapons are included in here as a risk, that would be an even bigger bar and would be a huge risk compared to all of these, greater than all of these. Climate change is a real problem because we're now creating conditions which are not suitable for long-term human survival. We've gone way out of the range in which humanity developed, evolved, agriculture developed, and we're facing very serious problems. We've already seen the start of this with fires, droughts, flooding, and ultimately we'll see catastrophic sea level rise. There's been a whole series of climate negotiations. The developing countries agreed to mobilize 100 billion a year to help the developing countries, although in reality more like 10 times that amount was required, but they've failed even to meet their weak target, and they've only found about 80 billion a year. This has led to a complete failure, I would say, of the climate change negotiation process and a massive erosion of trust. We have huge military spending, which is standing at 2.24 trillion, or that's 2,240 billion. And here are the top countries and their spending, the main ones being USA, China, Russia, followed by India, Saudi Arabia, then the UK, Germany and France. And the money we need to deal with climate change is less than half of this global budget. UK military expenditure has also increased dramatically, and there's been another 2.3 billion a year allocated for Ukraine. We've got 1.5 to 2 billion more for UK nuclear weapons, more warheads as part of that without any justification or reasoning. And the spending on dealing with climate is about an eighth of that. And the type of money that's gone into new nuclear weapons is comparable to what's needed to settle teachers' pay or doctors' pay. So when people say the money isn't there, it's not true. There are choices about what money is spent on. The military carbon emissions themselves are huge, and our MOD has no meaningful reduction targets. If the military globally was a country, it would be the fourth biggest country. So the military, just in its existence, is a severe block to getting to zero emissions. It would be the fourth largest emitter following China, the United States and India. Now, looking at nuclear weapons, they're designed to be extremely destructive. Just looking at one weapon, the destruction is equivalent to months of artillery shelling in a few seconds. The overwhelming of medical facilities or no possible humanitarian assistance. And one Trident warhead, using very conservative estimates, would kill 80,000 and injure 200,000. That's equivalent to 6 months of casualties in the Ukraine war, and it's a similar terrible casualty rate as is ongoing in Gaza at the moment. The other real risk of nuclear weapons, that's more than one, a few, is the possibility of nuclear winter caused by soot high in the atmosphere, high above the weather system. And what we're talking about, and this is due on the latest studies, we're talking about 10 years of cooling, drought, starvation. And depending on the level of the nuclear conflict, the deeper the nuclear winter would be. And just one Trident submarine is quite capable of causing this on its own, somewhere between the damage caused by launch on warning and the regional conflict, which is based on 100 Hiroshima-type weapons in an India-Pakistan conflict. And the destruction of the launch on warning weapons is 260 times all the bombs dropped in the 6 years of World War II, 260 times, including the 2 nuclear warheads dropped, which is an astonishing figure and illustrates the sheer destructive power of nuclear weapons. I think the core problem is deeply corrupt decision-making, because the money spent on weapons goes into the companies which then fund lobbyists and think tanks who are there to misinform us. The same cycle applies to climate inaction via fossil fuel subsidies and profit taking. So we have deeply corrupt decision-making, which leads us to out-of-control militarism, ongoing atrocities in Gaza, Ukraine, Yemen, across Africa. War doesn't solve anything. The end result is worse. We've only got to look at Afghanistan or Iraq. The only thing that can ever solve these things is proper peace negotiations and some form of justice for the people involved. The nuclear weapon states keep stating that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, but they continue to build and deploy and spend money on new nuclear weapons. And that's led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But to end on a positive note, we and the public are way ahead of our political leaders, and we must work even harder to mobilise resistance to our extinction and perhaps to rework an old slogan, better active today than radioactive tomorrow, or on a burning earth. So thank you for listening, and all the best for this very important conference.